Hi, I'm Brett Sankis. I'm an M&A or business lawyer, and I'm also an M&A advisor. As always, if you like this video, check out merger-resources.com. All the videos are uploaded there. Articles, tools, checklists, legal documents, all M&A, all free. This video is about the 10 steps in the M&A process, and it's from the seller's perspective. Still very useful to a buyer, and there's a lot of overlap, although at some point we'll do a video that's from the buyer's perspective. So step number one is really not part of the M&A process. It's pre-process, but it's important to call it out. If you're wanting to sell your company, the more lead time you can have, the more you can take steps to prepare your company to make it more attractive, get a higher valuation, the better, obviously. Now, a lot of people stumble into deals. Sellers just end up with something in their lap or all of a sudden need to or want to sell. But we represented a buyer not that long ago who really almost a year out started thinking about things to make the business more sellable. And I'll give you a couple. One is if you can create recurring revenue streams, much better than just having everything be sort of one-off. Or if you can have contracted revenue, meaning the buyers are obligated, the customers are obligated to purchase from you. Some businesses that's harder to do, but if you can take steps, recurring revenue is gold. Take yourself, if it's a small business and you are kind of the middle of it and everything runs around you, maybe you're the brand or you're just involved in everything, got to take some steps to separate yourself out of the business and make this look like a system that can run, a business that can run without you. Really important. If you've got some high hope initiatives, some things you think are really gold and are going to be big for the company, got to take some steps on those now. Now, you might not necessarily get a lot of credit if they're not very far down the road, but you're going to get no credit really from a sale or valuation standpoint if it's just ideas that the buyer can implement totally on their own. But if you take some steps down the path of implementing some of these high hope ideas, maybe you get some credit. And who knows? I mean, it might take you longer to sell than you think. Your first deal might fall out and you got to come back to the well. I mean, who knows how long down the path you are. So really think about those sort of low-hanging fruit, high hope initiatives that you can do on day one. So that's all pre-process stuff. Step two is assemble your M&A team. Now, this video, I'm sort of have in mind a business that might sell for $2 to $5 million, something like that. I mean, it can be larger businesses, but we're not really talking about businesses selling for a couple $100,000. The steps are still similar, but when it comes to an M&A team, it might be very different. If you sell a $100,000 business, your team might be your cousin who does environmental law and is willing to look at the contract. I mean, at some point, there aren't enough resources or things going on to have a team. But for a business that's, again, a couple $1 million, value, $5 million, $10 million and on up, you're going to have four sort of big contingents from a team perspective. One is going to be the sales professional. So when I say M&A advisor, that's what I mean. We market businesses for sale. You might also hear the term business broker or investment banker. And they fundamentally do the same thing in the world. They package your business up, they present it well, and they go find buyers to bid on it. So that's the first prong of your team. The M&A attorney or corporate lawyers are going to be another prong. Now, they're not always involved heavily on, but you still want to understand who they are and have them ready to go and know who you're going to rely on when you need it. And if it's someone who's got a lot of experience in the space, you probably making phone calls sooner than you. The heavy lifting for lawyers comes later on in the process. I'll get to that. But you still probably have a lot of questions along the way about just how things are going to go, and having them on board early is helpful. A CPA, tax or accounting professionals, that's when we're in small business territory. They often have someone who just prepares their tax returns, an HR block kind of group, but not really a lot of strong help, like really sort of professionals looking at tax structuring and things like that. But as a business has more transactional value, you ought to have someone who's got that set of eyes. They won't be super involved, but there'll be provisions, clauses in the ultimate purchase agreement that you'll want them to look at, and there'll be just questions around tax and accounting that you need to have them lined up. And then fourth is going to be your internal team. So most businesses, occasionally we have sellers who tell all of their employees, tell everyone, listen, we're thinking about selling the company, we're going to start talking to people. That's pretty rare. More often than not, the employees are told after the business is sold or right before it's sold. But there's always a group, even in that case, of what we call almost always of employees who are under the hood, so to speak. They're part of the internal team. They know about the deal. And some of that's just unavoidable. Some of your employees are going to be answering questions, provide information, and need to respond to due diligence requests that they're going to find out something's going on. And it's better just to let them know earlier rather than let the rumor mill circulate. So there's going to be a certain number of employees who are going to be involved, or you feel like you just owe it to them, whatever it is, there's going to be a certain internal team. Step 3 is preparing the company to be sold. So this is the pre-sale period. And before I talked about the pre-process period, starting a year out and thinking about how to make your company more attractive, this is the pre-sale period. This is actually, we're doing this. We have a team assembled. Let's get going. And so one of the things that you will do, investment bankers, M&A advisors will be really heavy, will be the heavier lifters on this piece, but is creating the seller documents. So there'll be a non-disclosure agreement that is confidentiality that you'll share with buyers, or the buyers will need to sign during the process to get a lot of information about your company. There'll typically be a one-pager or a teaser, which is some very basic information without identifying information. So prospective buyers shouldn't be able to identify the company, but just enough to kind of whet their appetite. That's why they call it a teaser. There'll be a seller presentation. Sometimes you'll hear the term CIM or CIM, which stands for Confidential Information Memorandum. There is sometimes a seller's disclosure statement, kind of like you would see in residential real estate. Not always, but business brokers use that a lot. So these things are going to be put together. You're going to work with your business broker or banker to put those together. You're also going to have a lot of internal work done. You're going to have internal cleanup. I have a video called The 6 Things to Do Before Selling Your Business. And that's not the sort of recurring revenue and take yourself out of the center of things. That's not and we need to do a video about that, about how to make the business a lot more attractive and get a better valuation. But these are sort of back office things to make sure you don't run into roadblocks and problems, get your ducks in a row, your financial statements and so forth. So there'll be sort of all of that. There'll be the start of due diligence, which is a process that runs all throughout. We'll get to it in a couple steps, but it really is always there lurking. It's a big part of what's going on here, especially from the buyer's perspective. But you will start to put together a due diligence folder or a data room, which really is a folder, but there's software products out there. Back in the days, 20 years ago, we used to have physical war rooms or data rooms where people would come in and just mountains of armies, busloads of investment bankers and consultants and attorneys would come in and just review all the actual documents in a room. They'd check them out and sit there all day. Nowadays, it takes place online. There's some standalone products, or it's just a Google Drive. You just need a record of who's accessing what. But you're going to start to get things in order and prepare for due diligence. So that's part of this early process. A couple other things is that you will spend some time on initial structure. So this is where CPA and tax professionals and attorneys are helpful to think about, how do I want to sell this business? We've got a video about different ways to sell the business you can check out, but there's 3 fundamentally. There's asset sale, there's a merger, and there's a stock or equity sale. They are all ways of selling the whole business. Don't be misled by the term asset sale. It's still a sale of the business, but they have different legal, tax, operational, administrative consequences. And you want to get a sense for whether or not there's big tax consequences to you to do it one way or the other. Asset deals, which are very common down in the Main Street part of the market, a couple $1 million and under, very, very common for a few reasons, are sometimes problematic if you've got a lot of contracts that need to be assigned, or if you have permits or licenses. Those are very hard to assign from one company to another oftentimes, especially if they're governmental organization licenses or certifications. So sometimes an equity deal or stock deal can get around that. But this is the time to start thinking about what's important. Now, the buyer might have their own view on the world, and sometimes the buyer and seller's interests are pretty aligned around transferring contracts and assets, for example. But it's not too early at this point to start thinking about that, especially if there's going to be real tax consequences to you. And fourth, you'll work with your investment banker or broker to set the valuation. Ultimately, a business is classically, it's worth what a willing buyer and willing seller are willing to do a deal at. It's going to be worth what the market says it's worth, but you still want to understand, what can I expect here? What's realistic? Do I still want to do the deal if it's only X? If you're listing the business for sale, that's what the business brokers do. They list the businesses online. The investment bankers run a process to go out and find buyers and bring them in. You will need to have a price. You'll need to quote a price, not necessarily on the site, but sometimes on the site, yeah. But in any case, you need to have a good idea of what valuation is, and sometimes you actually need to set an offer. Okay, fourth step of the process is actually marketing the business for sale. And this is where your broker, banker, M&A advisor are going to be very front and center. So there are a couple different ways to do this. As I just explained, the business brokers will list the sites, kind of like residential realtors do, or even commercial in today's world online, but they'll list it for sale. Investment bankers don't do that. They have tombstones that show the sold businesses on their site, but they don't have the listings. And it's really because these aren't the kind of businesses as you get up in the higher and higher in the market that just people are knocking around online trying to find. But down in the Main Street part of the market, that is the buyers. They're looking around for a business to buy, a restaurant to buy, a service business, whatever. So you see businesses under $5 million and under kind of listing online. The other way to do it is to actually a process of reaching out and finding the buyers. And that's what the investment bankers are going to do. And when we do this, we'll often do both, right? It's if the businesses we're representing our sort of target business is a $5 million business, that is hard to say where that's going to be sold. And so we have a parallel process. But if the investment bankers are running a process, it comes in one of two forms. One is an auction. And that's sort of the best way to sell a business. If you can pull off an auction, you've got to have a business that's really desirable. You know that there's going to be multiple bidders showing up. And what the bankers will do is reach out and they'll bring buyers through at a very set time frame. They'll tell them, here's the rules, here's the time frame. This is the only time really that we see a seller generally preparing the purchase agreement. We'll talk about agreements later on in a minute, but that's where the seller will prepare it and put it forward so the buyers can see it and mark it up. It's a very structured process that buyers who want to participate, not all will, but lots will, and they know they're competing in a process, and that's good in terms of leverage, and it brings them along. Now, what you don't want to do is have a failed auction where we've been through that for companies before. It happens no matter how well you plan things, but it's not ideal because you got to come back around to that group of buyers. If you go through an auction and you don't get what you want, you got to go back to those buyers and see, was it something about how we set it up? I mean, it's not a point of leverage basically come back and say like, hey, we didn't get any takers, but you still want to talk. It's just obviously, for obvious reasons, not the best look. But if you got an attractive enough company, bringing them through that process is awesome. Or the bankers, again, we're still subsets of ways that investment bankers will run a process, an M&A process, is just a direct negotiated process. And what they'll do, and again, when we do a parallel path, on this side of the process, we will generate a curated list of potential buyers, strategic buyers, financial buyers, and reach out to them one-on-one, have a conversation to see. You think about acquiring businesses, we're representing a seller, very basic information, nothing that's could identify the company, but just to see, do you want to take a look at the teaser? If they like that, do you want to sign a non-disclosure agreement and get more information? It's a direct negotiated process. So again, you've got listings, you've got an M&A process, and if it's a process, you've got auctions and direct negotiated path. Step 5, I touched on some of this, is going to be reaching out to buyers or screening inbound calls if it's a listing and just talking generally about what you have, talking about the company, very high level. None of this, the prospective buyers are not under non-disclosure. They don't have a confidentiality agreement signed at this point, so you're not going to share any super important information or usually even any identifying information about the business. And your broker or banker is going to do a little bit of light screening, try and whet the appetite for qualified buyers. The gate, we're not putting up a very high gate. There's no reason really to lose a buyer who just didn't look. I mean, you can't really always know, but sometimes we get a sense that there's just a weird call sometimes. And it's kind of obvious that maybe it's a competitor or someone who's just like, people tip their hand or just so obviously not qualified to buy the business or just absolutely kicking tires. Again, the bar's not going to be super high at this point because we're not sharing any critical information. We're going to give them a teaser and see if they want to take the next step. But we're still doing a little light screening and some light whetting the appetite, preparing, start pre-selling basically. We're selling at this point, but like light selling to get people interested and whet their appetite. Step 6, and we touched on it earlier, is due diligence. This, again, is a step, it's hard to know where to put it because it runs all the way throughout the process. When it came up earlier, I was talking about sellers preparing for due diligence. So pulling together the folder or the data room for due diligence, pulling together all their contracts. Your attorney can help you, your M&A attorney can help you with what a buyer's going to look at. It's going to be a lot. So due diligence is, I'm not going to kid you, it's not a super fun process from anyone's perspective, but particularly the seller. It can feel almost, root canal challenging at times and frustrating. It just goes on. And the larger the business, the more frustrating it can be because there's a lot more hands in the mix, a lot more questions, and doing a very organized process of managing due diligence is really important. But the more hands in the mix, the more niche the questions, the more one-off phone calls to run things to ground, the more often that you hear the same question 3 times, it's just kind of inevitable. We think, though, from your perspective, it's you want to just manage it as well as you can and realize it's part of the process and it will end. And buyers ask a lot of questions, and the questions are very rarely deal killer questions, but they can come in the form. They can feel like that sometimes, like, oh no, this guy's falling. Just get good advisors to walk through, be open and transparent. You've got a duty, really. Buyers have an expectation of seeing everything they need to see and asking about anything that they want. Sometimes there's very sensitive information, customer level or price information, sometimes from an antitrust perspective, or just for strategic reasons that we hold back until very close to closing or even after closing sometimes. But for the most part on due diligence, buyers going to want to see kind of a lot of stuff. Now, we think about due diligence in 2 levels. One is pre-letter of intent. I'll get to letters of intent in a moment. The other is post-letter of intent. The first level is going to be pretty high level. And this is before letter of intent. Usually buyers want to see some basic information. They want to see some financial statements. Don't necessarily have to see names of customers, but they'll want to see customer concentration. That's a big deal. If you have one customer who generates 70% of your business, you've got a challenge on your hands from selling that business. There's no question. Unless the buyer has just been trying to get into that business forever, to sell into that business and hasn't been able to. That's a huge risk factor if that one client doesn't transition. If that one client is really unhappy to lose, you as their point of contact, let's say. The business will keep going, but depending, it's obvious that there's been transitions. That customer concentration is a real big deal. So they want to understand that. They want to get a sense for how much of the business is recurring and contracted, and maybe want to know about litigation and what you're doing about certain things that are hot button issues in the industry, things like that. But it's fairly high level stuff. It's usually not bank statements or tax returns to confirm the numbers on your financial statements. That's all going to be saved for the second level. And you as a seller want to control this and make sure that you're not giving more information than you need to for a few reasons. 1, your time. 2, sensitive information, sharing sensitive information with parties who are never going to really be a buyer or even offer to buy the company. And 3, you want to bring buyers along. Like, ultimately during due diligence, things come out that aren't wonderful. No company's perfect. And we're not trying to hide those things, but you're just trying to give them enough to get them to the next step. And buyers are going to drive the process of due diligence. They're going to give you a due diligence request list. Sometimes they'll give you this they tend to be, and they can be 10 pages long. But a lot of times an attorney's prepared it but doesn't know exactly what your business is about. And so it's not even always that customized to your business. It can be a little frustrating. But if you get a 5, 6, 7, 8 page document during level 1 before we even get to a letter of intent, or we even know if this prospective buyer is interested in making an offer, that's not what you should be responding to. That's the level 2 list. Your first one should be much more streamlined, what you're responding to. In any case, though, it's coming from the buyer. Nevertheless, as a seller, you're getting prepared. You're anticipating all the things that they're going to want. You're doing your back office due diligence folder. You're putting that together and getting it ready, your data room, to be prepared. But again, the buyer's really going to drive the process ultimately. Step 7, letters of intent. Now, a letter of intent is not always used, but it is very typically used in M&A deals. Sometimes they're called heads of terms or term sheets, or indication of interest is a slightly different thing, but there's different terms to sort of define what is almost always, it's a written document, agreement that's signed or at least delivered. It's typically non-binding for almost all purposes. An indication of interest isn't even always signed, but a typical letter of intent will be signed by both parties. It will be something like 2 to 10 pages. It will talk about in very high-level terms the major deal points, purchase price, what's being bought, how it's being structured. Oftentimes, if some part of the purchase price will be held back in escrow, like big deal points, anticipated closing time, things like that. The provision that is, the clauses that are binding typically is exclusivity. So the buyer will prepare a letter of intent typically, and it will have a section in there called exclusivity where the buyer requires that you, the seller, stop talking to other potential buyers. And that for X number of days, usually between 60 and 120, that you don't have any conversations whatsoever about selling your business. The buyer's perspective is, at this point, I'm going to make an offer, you're going to accept it, and wants to prevent you just from taking that and shopping that around town, and you had your time to do that. So very, very typically there'll be exclusivity. If a non-disclosure agreement hasn't been signed before this, and it should have been in almost all cases, but if it hasn't been, confidentiality will be binding. Sometimes there's a breakup fee or in big deals there always is, like public company deals, but sometimes there's a breakup fee or deposit or something that needs to be binding in some ways. But most of it, the deal terms are not binding. And so you may say, why am I signing an agreement that's not binding? And that's a very good question. The reason is to make sure the parties are on the same page about the major deal points. There won't be everything that's going to be negotiated. That's going to come later on. But you want to know early on if we have some obvious showstoppers. Let's get those out on the table. It can be renegotiated later on, but parties understand generally the challenge of retrading something without a valid reason to do it if they signed a letter of intent. So a lot of parties will try to hold you to a letter of intent. If not contractually, they can't because it's non-binding, at least sort of just morally or just from a pressure standpoint. But it helps you see, are we on the same page? And that exercise with us, could cost $5,000. It's not nothing. I mean, there's some hours sunk into it. It's generally going to save us time later on. It's going to save us a lot of time if you don't have a deal on your hands. So very, very typical. Step number 8 is choosing a buyer. Now, not every business has the luxury of looking at multiple offers and having multiple letters of intent in front of them. If your business is sold as an auction process or an investment banker, you better well get a couple buyers. I mean, the process ought to end up in that situation. If you hired investment bankers to run a process and they run an auction process, you ought to end up with multiple buyers. I mean, it doesn't always happen, but it's not only the goal, it's the expectation. If your business was sort of worthy of being marketed in an auction process, you ought to be able to get down to multiple buyers. But even if you do a listing process through a broker or a curated sort of direct negotiated process, the goal is to end up with multiple options at some point. That's just better because you can leverage them against each other. You can have more confidence as a seller that you found the point, you found true value in the market. That's really the goal. So if you can sit down and have multiple letters of intent to look at, that is where you want to be. Those letters of intent are rarely going to be apples to apples. The purchase price obviously is going to be a very important number for you, but it's not always just straight up cash. Sometimes they'll ask you to carry back some seller financing. Sometimes some portion of the purchase price may be deferred, meaning owed but not paid up front. Or it may be contingent, which means the buyer's only going to pay that if certain things happen post-closing. There'll be deal structure terms. One buyer might want to buy your assets and another wants to buy the equity of the business. Again, it's all the whole business is what we're talking about, but it have different tax and legal consequences for you. There might be you as a seller, like the individual, like officers of the company may need negotiating deals to work for the buyer afterwards. Those are material economic terms. So there's a lot of different things that come into choosing a buyer. And then you're going to get into the nuts and bolts of which buyers could be more likely to close. What do we know about these buyers? Financial buyers, like private equity groups, are very different buyers than strategic buyers. We have videos all about that you can check out. But you're going to work with your sales professional, your investment banker, or business broker to figure out who's the best buyer to take to the altar. Step number 9 is negotiating, preparing, and signing eventually the final documents, or sometimes what are called definitive documents. And this typically starts sometime towards the end of second level of due diligence. It can start earlier, but at some point you're going to get full into the core of the actual legal documents that will bind the parties to the deal. And that's a purchase agreement, a stock purchase agreement, or an asset purchase agreement, or a merger agreement. And if we've done a letter of intent, again, which we usually do, it will have fleshed out the major sort of deal points or business points and some of the legal points, but then there's a lot in the weeds in a purchase agreement on any deal, a deal of any size with attorneys on it. There's a lot of representations and warranties, which are statements of fact about the business as it exists today that are highly negotiated. It's just kind of pages and pages of stuff that are going to form the essence of, are going to create the structure for a buyer to come back after a seller after the deal is done for post-closing liability to recover some money, or if there's an escrow holdback, funds held back by the buyer that are the seller's funds, if everything goes well, the buyer can draw down from those. So these representations and warranties are probably more legalese and in the weeds than you want to get, but you're going to have to become if you're a seller, you need to become a student or understand what they are, because they're significant and they're a really important part of it. So these actual legal documents, that purchase agreement or merger agreement, sometimes there'll be a bill of sale. If it's an asset deal, there'll be resolutions or minutes of meetings of directors and stockholders. There'll be employment agreements, restrictive covenant agreements are sometimes carved out, which is a non-compete. There'll be, if the seller is going to work for the buyer, there could be new agreements giving them equity in the new business. So all those things, the definitive documents are part of that step 9. And this is where the lawyers take center stage. There'll still be times when the business people have their side calls and business points to be ironed out. And, business versus legal point it's tough to make a distinction. They sort of overlap and fold into each other at some point, but there's certainly some things that the attorneys will recognize are easier conversations to have amongst themselves and maybe kind of things that they can just sign off on. And then the business points are things that the attorneys aren't in a position to say, should the purchase price change, or what employees are going to go work for the buyer, or how long the non-compete is going to be, or, all sorts of things that in the process we generally distinguishing among those things, because it makes sense as you get closer and closer to finishing a purchase agreement. You want to have a hit list of what are the open items, what can we send to the business people, what are the attorneys can resolve among themselves, and when do we need to get an all-hands call and just knock this stuff out together. So that's that whole process. And step 10 is closing. Now, in a one-time sign and close deal, we sign and close on the same day. In a 2-step, there's a signing day and then there's a closing day at some point. To a large extent, the signing day is kind of viewed as the closing in a way, because the deal is effectively usually the deal is done. There might be contingencies, right? There will be contingencies in a 2-step sign and close, but they ought not to be the kind of thing that are in either party's control. They ought to be the kinds of things that we expect to get checked off. They're somewhat perfunctory. It could be stockholder approval. Whether or not it's a foregone conclusion, we expect it to happen. And our work, buyer and seller have agreed, they're done. As long as the money shows up, the stockholder approval shows up, antitrust is cleared, whatever it is. So signing kind of becomes closing because both parties have said, hey, we want to do a deal. But let's look at the one-time sign and close, where the definitive agreements that we talked about in step 9 are all done and ready to be signed. We're ready to go. Let's do it. Closing is that final moment when those agreements are signed and money changes hands. Closings have gotten to the point in modern M&A where they're really very anticlimactic experiences, because we're not all around a closing table any longer. It's not even like, going into a title company to buy residential real estate still, it has more formality and sort of process to it, if you will. It feels like a bigger thing than an M&A deal. The parties have gotten to the point where they're finally ready. Send me the documents to sign and let me get a wire, right? That's really what's going on. And so we're not rarely around a closing table, rarely doing a closing dinner together like in the old days. What happens is the lawyers are managing signature pages to documents. A lot of times it's by DocuSign. Lawyers are generally collecting the signature pages. So each side, the buyer and seller's attorneys, will collect the pages and tell the other side's attorney, tell the other party that, hey, we have them all. So what I'll say, if I'm representing the sellers, I've got all the signature pages, all the things the seller and the seller's officers and directors and shareholders need to sign. I have it all. The buyer will tell me they have everything for the buyer, and we'll get on a call where we say, are we done? Can we release signature pages? And the buyer and the seller are usually on the call, the business people, and they say yes and yes and yes, and then the wire is sent. Like, press the button on the wire at that moment in time. But that call may be 10 minutes. If you haven't been through one, I promise you're going to think that's it for the closing. But it's obviously a very important milestone. And if you're a seller, you'll be looking for that wire, which for a lot of our sellers is life-changing money. And that's when the deal is done, right? I guess there's worlds in which deals are rescinded. But at that point, you're done as a seller. You might have some consulting to do, or you might go work for the buyer, but you got paid and you're rewarded for your work, hopefully nicely. So that's a big deal and a big moment. It's just actually in practice not a very noteworthy experience in hindsight. And that's it. Those are the main 10 steps. Those are from the seller's perspective. We'll do a video at some point about them from a buyer's perspective. A lot of the same steps, but there's just a different look at what's going on sometimes. And look, M&A is a fluid process. Every deal really sounds trite, but a little bit different. Those aren't the only steps involved, and sometimes they're not always in that order. There's times when there'll be management presentations. There'll be a whole round of that. Sometimes we'll spend time valuing the company. As an M&A advisor, not as a lawyer, we do that. There's things that are noteworthy. It could be their own steps, but they're just not sort of typical. And if you understand these 10, you understand the process, and you'll feel at home as it moves on and things move forward. As always, thank you for listening to this video. If you have any questions, please drop a question down below. Check out merger-resources.com for all sorts of other videos and materials and things to help you in your M&A journey. So thank you.